Welcome boys and girls, Christine here with a discussion about the endgame problem of Total War Warhammer 3 Mortal Empires. It is an issue that almost every single game in the series does have. Basically, if you're starting a campaign in a Total War game, it's generally going to go something along these lines. You're going to have some immediate issue. In the case of Karl France, it's the Empire Secessionists and Khazrak. Then you have short-term issues, Kemmler, Vlad, Festus. If you're looking at Attila, it's the rebellions as the immediate issue. And then you have a couple of the tribes. But regardless, once you do overcome those initial issues, those short-term issues, that will make or break your campaign. You will rarely lose a campaign or genuinely be threatened in a campaign if you do overcome that early game well enough. That's roughly 20, 30 plus turns. Depends on the game, depends on the setting, depends on your campaign settings, but that's roughly the timeline we're talking about. Now, this has been an issue for a very long time. Now, Creative Assembly has tried various tricks in order to make a satisfying endgame. You can think about Realm Divide, you can think about Attila, you can think about the Mongols in Medieval 2. None of those have really worked, because those tricks just end up creating a real grind in a campaign, a very tedious grind, or you're steamrolling the campaign. Generally, it's a bit of both. It is a tedious grind because you're dealing with a lot of enemy forces, and you're also steamrolling at the same time because you're not really going to lose battles, you're not going to lose the campaign. It's just a question of spending turns to get armies to the field, etc., and then winning the campaign. It is not the great dynamic. The quote-unquote endgame of Immortal Empires is the endgame crisis. Kind of rogue armies or rogue factions, though not quite, but a bunch of super powerful factions being spawned at a specific point. It doesn't really work out to create a fun, dynamic, and even challenging endgame situation. And you can have a lot of armies there. Like, at one point, I was dealing with 20 Skaven armies with Malachi in Lustria in a specific scenario. And while there was a lot of Skaven to kill, I managed to deal with that without too much hassle. So that is a problem that Creative Assembly does need to resolve. The only Total War game that actually has a good endgame and a good difficulty curve, because it is an inverted difficulty curve. It's a situation of having the early game being far more challenging than the middle game or the late game. That's not a great dynamic in any video game of any genre you can think of. The only Total War game that I've ever played that did this better was Three Kingdoms. So if you're playing Three Kingdoms, you would have your short-term threats, your immediate threats, short-term threats. But then in the mid and late game, certain factions would become far more powerful. And in the first campaign, I actually completed the Three Kingdoms as Cao Cao, Wu, Sun Jian, ended up controlling a third of the map. Now, so put yourself in my shoes, or to make a comparison in Warhammer 3. Imagine you're playing a campaign as Karl France. You deal with the situation in the Empire, you unify the Empire, and then Grimgor controls all of Cathay, all of the Darklands, all of the Mountains of Morn, and he's coming for you. Or Archeon has taken control over the entirety of the Northern Chaos Wastes, he's taken control over all of Norsca, and he's coming for you. Actually, in Three Kingdoms, both would happen at the same time, because you'd have at least two other mega factions. So I did have Yan Shao to deal with, I did have Wu to deal with as Cao Cao. It was a bit crazy. I did manage it. Diplomacy, winning certain key battles, forcing a peace agreement with one of them and all that, which is, by the way, one of the things that Three Kingdoms did so much better with its quote-unquote endgame crisis than Warhammer 3, because in Warhammer 3 you don't have diplomacy with endgame crisis by default, and if you do, it's very easy to abuse that. No, there I had to actually fight a lot of battles, and then I was able to avoid having to conquer a vast amount of territory to actually win. But it was fun, it was interesting, it was, how in the world am I going to survive this? Took some doing, I gotta tell you. But that was a really fun and dynamic endgame situation in Free Kingdoms, as opposed to the situation that happens in Warhammer 3. You take over the Empire, no one's going to challenge you. No one's going to come even remotely close to challenging you in that kind of situation. And that's the problem that we do have right now. Endgame crises can have a lot of armies for you to deal with, but that's different and certainly not as challenging as a faction legitimately building a massive freaking empire across the map, stabilizing that situation, and creating a challenge. So maybe what Creative Assembly could do is when you start a campaign, using Karl Franz as an example, you would have some factions being super powered from the start, maybe progressive benefits higher and higher. So for instance, let's say I start a campaign as Karl Franz, they could go with, say, Gorbad becoming a mega threat, or Ikkeklot becoming a mega threat, taking a lot of territory and becoming stronger and stronger, and then you having to deal with that. And also at the same time, maybe Norska, maybe Archeon, and you have to deal with that. And they're not just going to come at you with some armies that were spawned out of thin air, but they're actually going to come with real armies led by lords they've leveled up. It's also a question of AI cheats, because one of the problems in Warhammer 3, in the way that difficulty is handled, the AI gets benefits, but it's a flat benefit situation. Yes, there's faction potential, but the benefits we're talking about, recruitment benefits, income benefits, casualty replenishment benefits, etc., those are the same benefits they're going to start the campaign with. They don't become great, or they don't get extra benefits. It can be very different. Now, I'm not saying or advocating for any particular solution on this, but I do think the difficulty curve should be more linear as opposed to inverted. I think factions should become stronger over time as opposed to having the same kind of benefits as they start with. That is my perspective on the matter. But of course, there are some other issues as well. It's also a question of objectives. Like, even when you complete a campaign against a powerful foe in Warhammer 3, it feels like, oh, that's great, I get an achievement. No real endgame cinematic, no real sense of satisfaction, nothing that you really feel that you earned. This is where I can accuse Creative Assembly of being cheap, and I would make this accusation for 20 years now. Like, how hard, and I'm gonna be serious here, you can't tell me as a company that's made this much money, it is very difficult to hire a bunch of people to have more than one cinematic or two cinematics per faction. You can't tell me that it's hard or expensive to hire voice actors to record more than a couple of voice lines of dialogue. We need more story. We need more cinematics. We need more character interactions. Stop cheaping out on that. And that's the thing that, by the way, really angers me with Creative Assembly over the years. Like, the cheap effort they've put in game after game, the repeatable victory cinematics, if we even have victory cinematics in a campaign, but reused voice lines, reused cinematics, very little effort in the stuff we have. Just a lack of effort. It's actually something that a lot of strategy game developers are guilty of, to be clear. Like, that lack of effort. Some of the best strategy games are those that put in the effort, that went that extra mile. You think of World and Conflict, you think of StarCraft, you think of Warcraft. Sure, the stories may not have been the best in the world, but they had them. They had those moments. Imagine playing Warcraft 3 and you don't have the ending cinematic of Warcraft 3 Frozen Throne. Imagine you had only a third of the dialogue of Warcraft 3. And it's not like Warcraft 3 is filled with dialogue. So imagine that kind of situation. So yeah, I think that CA should stop cheapening out on these things. I understand hiring voice actors is not necessarily the cheapest thing. But if you want people to be invested in a story, if you want people, or a campaign, then you need to give them that experience. And I get it, there's all kinds of scenarios. But imagine you're playing a campaign as Karl Franz, and the endgame crisis, the random endgame crisis, the random endgame enemy that you'd have to deal with is, let's say, Drazov. And imagine you have a bunch of unique lines and cinematics for that. I know it would be a lot of work, I'm not saying it wouldn't be. But that's why it matters to put in that kind of effort, because that would make for a hell of an experience in the game. Beyond that, we also got to talk about objectives. So one of the things many other Total War games have done is create different objectives dependent on the stage of the campaign you were in. Warhammer 2 had the chapters. Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2 had different chapters. So you had your ultimate campaign objectives, but you also had the chapters. They gave you money, the objectives themselves were not necessarily the best designed, but it was something at least. Nowadays, we just have our victory conditions, maybe a couple of random missions that aren't particularly great. This is one of the reasons I really like the Dwarves, because you do have those kind of dynamic objectives for the Age of Reckoning, and then you have confederation of all legendary lords within the same race, so a campaign as Malachi where we confederate Grumbrindle, and he has territory here, as opposed to him being wiped out, is a very different affair. And yeah, those legendary grudges as long-term objectives. Those legendary grudges, each of them is a far more fulfilling and interesting campaign objective to aim for than any victory condition we have right now in the game. And then, you know, Malachi's adventures on top of that. That's the reason Malachi's campaign is the best campaign in the entire game, because they did put in that effort to a degree. Still missing cinematics, still missing dialogue, still missing a lot of good stuff, but... And dealing with a bunch of rogue armies is not really fun. But at least it was something more than what everyone else has. I understand it, that there are limits, but this is not just about Warhammer 3, it's also about the future Total War. Because I'm going to say it right now, if any other Total War game comes out, and we just get 4 factions, and the same ending cinematic for all of them, and very few voice lines, and that's a 40k game, yeah, you're going to crash and burn very hard on that Creative Assembly. I'm just giving a warning. I'm not saying I won't play it, I will. I'll buy it if I need to. You know, it doesn't matter if I get the copy or I have to buy it, I'll still play it, but a lot of people are not going to be satisfied with that. So, objectives, story, cinematics, etc. But that is absolutely something that's lacking. Another problem, though, has to do with supply lines, actually, or armies in general. Basically, for a lot of Total War games, we have some limitation on how many armies we can have, be it resources or supply lines or something else. Now, it doesn't work either way. Neither what we have in Warhammer 3 or what we have in Warhammer 2 as 2 examples. In Warhammer 2, you end up with too few armies, and you end up having to dealing with 6 stacks at the same time, and you might have 2 free armies at most when you're dealing with that because you can't afford more. That can make things a bit more interesting, but it's also just tedious. You know, just having to fight endless battles like that. In Warhammer 3, we have the situation that we can afford 20 armies to deal with 20 enemy armies, and then the game breaks because the game is not designed for more than 4 armies of separate factions, I should add, fighting against each other. Realistically, more than 2 armies for one particular faction is really the limit of how many units. Now, battles themselves can actually support more units. I've played battles with like 160 units on the enemy side because I went crazy, or 80 units, right? The game can actually handle that, but you do have that limitation of how many units you can bring in a battle, how many units a single faction can bring in a battle. So that's one of the problems of, like, let's just give the AI a lot of cheats and resources and all that, because just AI having more forces is not necessarily a solution, because it's not going to work due to the game mechanics. Now, those could be changed, but I do think there could be a better way of handling it, as opposed to just increasing the upkeep of armies by a high margin. Supply lines are not a great system, but nor is it a great system for everyone to run around with 20 armies and then you can only bring 2 of those armies to individual battles. That also doesn't work. You end up with the Bloodfist, you end up with spam, you end up with bloated campaigns, bloated factions. That also breaks the game. I think Troy and Pharaoh can present something of a solution on this, or an alternative to how this could be done, as opposed to just the flat supply lines or no supply lines whatsoever. In Total War Pharaoh and in Troy, we don't have supply lines. We have administration. Administration works very differently because it's not just the armies you have, it's everything that you own. So it's generals, the people leading the armies, it's the units inside the armies, it's the settlements you have. You can have a whole bunch of generals running around that won't inherently affect your supply lines as much as just recruiting a second army would in Warhammer 3 or Warhammer 2, especially Warhammer 1 and 2. This was something they did in Troy because we had a bunch of special characters that could only be generals, and it was annoying to try and get them on the field because of supply lines. But this system is fantastic because you start your campaign with an upkeep benefit. So you gain more food and bronze. Those basically stand in for gold. Units cost food and bronze. Some might cost wood, but generally it's food and bronze that units require in terms of upkeep. But as you're playing for the campaign, as your empire grows and larger and larger, the more territory you have, the more units you have, you're going to start paying an extra upkeep. But you also gain some benefits. It might be more expensive to recruit native units. Native units are tied to territory, not the specific faction. You do have your faction units, but you take less attrition damage, you get increased replenishment, or your replenishment cap gets increased, and your movement at sea is also increased. So you can handle a bigger empire better. Now, if we were to consider Warhammer 3, the way I would see this working better in Warhammer 3 is we start a campaign, we get a gold benefit, an upkeep benefit, a construction benefit, construction cost benefit, but as we grow our empires larger and larger, we might pay more for construction, we might pay more for recruitment, we might pay more for upkeep, but we might be able to recruit units faster, we might be able to construct things faster, we might be able to traverse things faster, all those kind of things. There's a lot of different possibilities. I won't necessarily go into the weeds of that, but I think things like general ranks, things like unit experience, faster research, construction time, because construction time is a very tedious thing to deal with, would work very well. On top of that, in Pharaoh, we actually start with a decent amount of resources for a number of turns at the beginning of a campaign. Once you get past those turns, you'll lose those resources because the game just basically, it's there to overcome the tedium of the early game, and also because we have all kinds of different resources in Pharaoh and Troy, but you overcome that slow tedium of the early game, but it does matter in a longer campaign. The longer you play a campaign, the more you're going to have to worry about it. So it's about building an empire properly. It's about managing it. There's a lot of bloat in Pharaoh, and that's one of the big issues. But the actual design intent of Pharaoh dynasties is pretty good in many ways. Some things are bad. The siege situation, yeah, it's bad, and I really don't want them to replicate that in Warhammer 3, which is seemingly what they're doing right now. But there's a lot of great things over here as well. Then we also have campaign victory conditions. So you have minor victory, major victory, and ultimate victory. These are, you win this through victory points. Basically, controlling certain territory through objectives. You have many different objectives, landmarks, ambitions, feats of rule. There's many different ways of handling this. It's not just a question of conquering a lot of territory. It's building up territory, achieving a certain income, doing something special with regards to the path to power or ancient legacy. That does count as well. There's many different ways of earning victory points, but victory points are what dictate your victory. So as opposed to just, take 35 settlements or something along those lines, you have a more dynamic system of achieving a campaign victory state. It feels a lot more satisfying doing so. Again, Pharaoh and Troy are not perfect. They have a lot of bloat. There's a lot of buildings. The amount of resources you're actually gaining per each settlement is pretty bad. But on a final point that I think Pharaoh does pretty well is what happens when you take over a settlement, when you fight a battle. Okay, so you auto-resolve a battle, in this case, or you just fight a battle. The actual battles do have problems. Generals give way too much of a morale boost, and there's a general in every single settlement. That's frustrating. But you get gold, you get bronze. You can maintain your economy for just post-battle loot. You can build around that. But when you take over a settlement, you have the following choices. You can raise a settlement for construction materials. You can sack it for unit income. You can loot and occupy it for a bit of resources, but at the cost of public order. But crucially, when you just occupy it, you're not gaining resources, but you are gaining growth points. This is something that CA has added for dwarves, ogres, or different factions, different campaigns in Warhammer 3. Where do you think that came from? There's a lot of things CA did in Troy, CA Sophia did in Troy and Pharaoh that actually have been added in Warhammer 2 and 3. Or rather in 3 specifically. Like the whole supporter system of Kislev was basically taken from Paris and Hector. It was, by the way, much better with Paris and Hector. But every building you construct in Pharaoh requires workforce. So you deciding not to sack a settlement and instead just occupy it, while you won't gain as much resources, it gives you a significant benefit in terms of building up your empire because you're just going to be able to construct buildings faster. So there's pros and cons. There's a lot of different ways you can play this game, and a lot of them do work. You can play a campaign as Skarbrand, kinda. Like, Ursu is very much like Skarbrand. Yes, I love that bastard. Ursu is just like, what if Skarbrand was actually a diplomat? But he would still burn everything to the ground that he encountered, but he could also become Pharaoh. I'm laughing my ass off because that's actually what I did in my campaign as Ursu, because it's like, even, like, I love that character. It's like, he's just a troll. Like, he's like what the changeling should be. Like, someone who's like, oh, I'm just gonna screw around with everyone. Oh, I'm gonna take, like, I want to bring about the end times, but I could just be Pharaoh of Egypt, become the most powerful conqueror in the land, and just bring about stability and peace and prosperity. Imagine someone like Skarbrand just pacifying the world. Hilariously, he can actually do so. No joke, you play Skarbrand in Warhammer 3, the real power is diplomacy. I know, it's fucking hilarious, but Khorne diplomacy works far better than you might think. But that's what I like about Pharaoh. Like, there's a lot of things that are not workable, but it's kind of a shame they abandoned it. I understand why, but there's so much potential in this game that was just kind of left at the door, right? Especially after they fixed it with the addition, they fixed battles with the addition of lethality. That was a fantastic change. Maybe we need that in Warhammer 3. That's a whole different discussion. But there's a lot of things in this game that they could take to improve campaigns, endgame, just the overall experience in Warhammer 3. That's all I had to say. Costin signing out.